Straw weaving and basketry can be regarded as cornerstones of craft culture in Jamaica, yet the histories behind these techniques have not been as cherished as the pieces they produce. These woven designs reveal histories across the Atlantic, as well as stories of movement and survival, dating as far back as the Tainos, serving a greater purpose as a tool of decolonization. Unraveling Connections, an exploration of straw weaving and basketry, seeks to question the archival silences present in straw weaving and basketry's histories and contextualize the gradual disappearance of these skills in our current cultural climate. Welcome to another in the series of Curating Culture. I'm Georgette McGlashen-Miller, Research Fellow at the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank. Today, my guest is Hannah Ashley Smith, who is a workshop facilitator and mixed media artist who utilizes collage to disrupt colonial historical narratives and explore Black speculative concepts. Her workshops focus on craft as a social and political tool to make liberatory knowledge accessible in community oriented spaces. Smith is inspired by the social and aesthetic capacity of textile practices indigenous to various West African cultures and the tangible history that connects the diaspora to the continent through her work. Welcome to Curating Culture, Hannah. Can you greet our audience and go right into it?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to share my research. So I should just start. My exploration of strawberry and basketry began with an interest in the social capacity of textiles. I define social capacity in the context of textiles as a medium's ability to build community, shape cultural identity, and be an invaluable archiving process outside the confines of Eurocentric documentation. So craft practices, and more specifically textiles, have continuously been disregarded and undervalued due to its categorization as a domestic hobby and the field being dominated by women. In my practice, I reframe textiles as a social and political tool to make liberatory knowledge accessible, and my intention was to explore straw weaving and basket making through this lens. So I began my investigation of this medium at the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank, in the written archives, connecting present forms of basketry and straw weaving to the forced displacement of people from West Central Africa and the gradual migration of the Arawak from the Orinoco Delta of South America. So we can start Bastr's history with the arrival of the Osteonoids, who traveled from South America to the Lesser Antilles, and then the Greater, and then finally Jamaica, where they developed into Lucayan Tainos, their tangible culture developing alongside them. Baskets in their culture were used both domestically and religiously. Two baskets we know existed during that time were the jaba, a tightly woven basket used to hold water, and the kibu canes, a basket used to extract cassava juice. Baskets were made of materials such as sisal, which is also seen in Kenyan baskets, as well as the wicker, and these baskets held offerings for demigods. Cotton was also farmed by the Tainos and used to make hammocks and attire. So, with the arrival of the Spanish in 1494 and the subsequent decimation of the Taino population, those who survived escaped to the Blue and Jonker Mountains, as well as the Carpenter Mountains, as terrain would provide protection. The Spanish replaced the Taino labor force with enslaved people imported from the Bakongoan and Upper Angolan regions, and most of these people were skilled and educated workers. They were able to retain aspects of their traditional art and religious practices amidst forced displacement, as they were not separated from their ethnic groups, which was done in other colonies. And in 1655, those enslaved were freed by their Spanish owners when the British invaded, and they also fled to the mountainous areas of the island, where they were formed maroon communities with the Tainos. Those freed were able to continue the craft practices they knew before enslavement, and now were tasked with applying this knowledge to their new environments to sustain themselves. Taino and Bakongo craft traditions, now coexisting in the mountainous highlands of Jamaica, had the opportunity to feed off each other and meet the needs of the Maroon movement. So, in Maroon societies, such as in Moortown, weaving had been used domestically and for defense. Examples of tools that were made were the kata, which is a circular cushioning made out of banana bark to relieve pressure from baskets on heads while carrying goods for long periods. Also, they hand spun yarn out of cotton to make oil wicks, and they made this large woven container called the bangu bage, which was carried on the back. Now, with a lot of this history, because it originated in oral format, there's lots of inconsistencies, especially with the history that derives from the African continent during the period of enslavement. So it really was a task for me to piece these histories together to create a central narrative through which we could trace basketry's history. So I was able to trace Bastry and straw weaving to the regions of Congo and Bakongo specifically, which are now known as the Congo and Angola in West Central Africa. Due to many slave traders gathering people from various ethnic groups and different parts of Africa, it is hard to specifically say where these histories originate. But in the Congo region, the basketry they produced or the basketry that they practiced used material raffia to make their baskets. And this material symbolized spirituality, wealth, and status of the Congo king, who is called Mani. Along with materials such as jipa japa, silver thatch, bulrush, banana bark, screw pan, and many others, raffia is also used in basketry and straw weaving designs presently in Jamaica. The artisans in the Congo and Bakongo regions made intricately embroidered textiles with this medium, and these skills were held in high regard, the knowledge being passed down through generations. Another piece that was made in the Congo region was called the Mpu, MPU. And this was a supple knotted cap made from golden raffia or pineapple fiber and signified a person elected to sacred leadership. It was a cosmological symbol that connected the chief, the kin group, and the village to a mythic place of origin. These caps were also always constructed in a spiral form, working from the center of the crown to the edge of the hat border. And these patterns, I could see some similarities with the baskets that we currently have in are currently produced by many of the artisans that are currently in Jamaica. So this history I shared with the Newell High School students in St. Elizabeth through a presentation. And this was done through the lens of reclaiming or historical narratives which have been affected by colonial perceptions. It was interesting to see how little this knowledge was known by the students, as well as many of the other artisans I spoke to who also informed my research. So during this time, I traveled to Rock Hall St. Andrew, Treasure Beach, and Point Hill St. Elizabeth, and went to the craft market at Waterfront, right beside the ACIJ in Kingston, to speak to and learn from the artisans practicing this craft. Along with learning some of the intricate techniques practiced by these artisans, they spoke of the issues affecting the continuation of this craft. So the average age of basket weavers right now is between 60 and 80 years old. One of the women that I spoke to suffered with arthritis and was unable to make baskets as quickly or source materials efficiently. They are also unable to find young people interested in learning the craft, which also aids in its discontinuation. The basketry medium and generally straw weaving has also historically been commonly associated with lower classes, and this has created a stigma around the craft, um, which allows for different artisans to not really want to continue spreading this knowledge. Also, artisans not necessarily interested in the medium. Also, there are artisans who are not necessarily interested in the medium as a craft, but see it purely as an economic tool, and entered the craft through this perspective due to maybe a lack of formal education and this knowledge being passed down to them from their different family members. So this was a very practical way of gaining an income very fast. There's also currently not a centralized archive of straw weaving techniques, and this knowledge is not presently taught in school. So this means that when I was traveling to different places to learn these techniques, many of them were very different depending on where you had gone. And also this technique not really being written down contributes to the fact that maybe in a couple of years, we might lose the essence of these techniques or not being able to learn from them in the same ways that we can right now. So, in both the research gathered from the archives and the conversations with the different crafts people, I realized that there was a trend of misdocumentation and lack of preservation of straw weaving. I found myself piecing together aspects of these histories to create a clearer narrative. We have historically had no control over the written documentation of our ancestors. Our stories in their purest form have been translated through song, dance, and craft historically. Oral history, though said to be susceptible to inconsistencies, as I've said before, holds a true voice of a people. I bore this in mind when interacting with the history of basketry. The importance of recounting this history not lying in the factual retelling of these crafts, but an understanding of its relevance as a social tool in our present context. The African American academic and writer Sadia Hartman speaks of the term archival violence in reference to the histories of enslaved people in the diaspora. What she means by this is that many of our ancestors, their livelihoods have been reduced to being a statistic in records, as well as recounts of the abuse they endured at the hands of their colonial masters. Similarly, due to the colonial retelling of our history, the tangible aspects of our culture are often missing or scattered as a result, and we are left to connect the pieces. The word I use to describe this mispreservation of straw weaving and basketry is archival silence. Archival silence can be defined as the unintentional or purposeful absence of or distortion of history, resulting in gaps which affect our perception of the past. I found this relevant to straw weaving and basketry, where there was more to reflect on in the gaps of our history than in the written aspects of it. The gaps I speak of reveal how colonial perceptions of African culture, which deems its history as primitive and not worth archiving, still colors our history today, and its legacy aids in the disappearance of not only straw weaving and basketry, but also other craft skills that do not adhere to capitalist method of production. Basketry and straw weaving have long been operating under capitalist lens. Initiatives such as Things Jamaican, a program headed by Edward Siaga during his term, with the goal of economic supporting basket weavers, while had its positive impacts from a financial standpoint, also intended on capitalizing on the product and not the continuation of knowledge and cultural retention of this craft. This is not a sustainable method of continuing a medium. An investment in knowledge and undoing of stigmas is necessary. In acknowledging the gaps in this history, we are better able to not repeat the devaluing of these skills, which can be reframed in current context as a decolonial tool. We can envision basket weaving as a decolonial tool as it can facilitate community and third spaces. It can reflect the people's intimacy with the land, which can also be a model for sustainable practices, as well as a tangible archive of migration and shifting identity. So that was a lot of information that I've just given you there. And I feel like a question that always comes up with this is how do we move forward? Well, the preservation of straw weaving does not equate to the memorialization of this medium. The craft is still alive, and therefore its value should be placed on the techniques and the creativity birthed from these artisans, not the product. Yes, the skill requires patience and the process is rigorous, but the culture is never stagnant. So there needs to be an allowance for innovation for these mediums to continue. These innovations can take up the forms of different materials, maybe recycled materials, different techniques that borrow from other existing traditions. But there are a lot of existing artisans right now that have a lot of creativity and ideas and need the space to be able to progress and innovate on this existing medium of straw weaving and basketry. So there needs to be a general change in perceptions of basketry and straw weaving, one that derives from a place of love for the craft and an honoring of its ancestral ties. And that's the end of my presentation.
A lot of information packed in a short while. And I've just been thinking about some of the things that you said, and in my memory, just looking back at all the times I've ever seen straw weaving or basketry. And one of the things like my first question would ask you to just highlight the difference between both of them. Some people might know, some may not know, as well as we're going to look to see if we have any questions from the viewers online as we have a discussion.
Okay, so I use straw weaving as a catch-all term because straw can be used to weave mats. It can be used to weave. I've seen little toys and dolls, but then basketry is very specific to basket making. So there are thicker materials such as silver thatch, which is used to make baskets, and then materials like jippa jappa, which can be more flexible and thinner, and is used to make different products.
Okay, but from your research and your presentation, I gather that your emphasis is on the technique because the craft is still present. Persons are still making baskets and doing straw weaving. But you're saying if the technique is preserved, we could use various materials to do this. Why that perspective?
Well, I think of technique because a product can only last for so long. If there's a knowledge of the history, um, this history and these techniques can then be passed on generationally. Baskets are made of straw, which deteriorates over time. So imagine if we stop making baskets right now, in 10 years, 20 years, these baskets might not exist, and this history would fail to be present in our lives. So I emphasize techniques because also transferable knowledge, meaning knowledge that is transferred generationally, that is a tool that has been used in many different indigenous populations in Africa and other parts of the world to retain one's identity and one's culture. Because this is something that is intrinsic to you, and to be able to have knowledge that is ancestrally tied to you, it brings about a strength and identity, at least in my perspective.
Yeah. So it is important and it is valuable because I remember I was sitting in a workshop and we were trying to work out the definition for intangible cultural heritage. And within the definition, there was a discussion about the artifact itself. And I was like, but an artifact is tangible. So why would you put it here? But at the same time, it's the knowledge that goes into creating the artifact. Because the point you made about, not having like the raffia or what the weave that we use to make the basket. No, if that's not present, but the technique and the style of doing it, we could use any other material to do it. In your presentation, you mentioned that in West Africa, they use a special technique to create, was it a cap for
Yes.
the
So
royalty?
yeah, the Mapo basket, the
The
Mapo
Mopo cups, right.
yes. So I mentioned that specifically because it was more than just a functional, item. It was used to connect to other worlds. And this was deemed as like a very priceless item. And I think it is necessary to think of basketry and just craft generally as more than just a functional item, because in the industry of the arts, craft is most likely put on a it's most likely undervalued, especially because it's a woman's dominated industry. So thinking of the ways historically baskets and straw woven items have been held in such high regard and have been used for religious practices, have been used to connect ancestrally, it gives us a new perception of these materials, and we can appreciate it more because I think a general need with basketry and straw weaving is a appreciation, and I think an added cultural perspective is what can add that value.
Well, the cultural perspective definitely will have to change because in our culture, in our Jamaican culture, when we speak about basket, as you have said, it's always identified with the lower classes. And I mean, when the things that come to my mind readily about basket, it's Miss Lou, carry me Akigo Linseed Market. And it tells you that, it's the commercial aspect of the basket again. And then there is the connotation of get basket to carry water, which is also something negative. Again, we don't really talk about baskets in a positive way, much less to get to the history to say that, like language, like other intangible cultural tools that we have, that the basket carries a history of our people. And it's interesting to know that not just from West Africa, but even the Tainos that were here. Because I remember I was writing a paper about the Tainos and I came across the Jabas or the Habas. And I'm saying if this knowledge was prevalent among Jamaicans, we would not have the saying, use basket for carry water and it would mean a disadvantage because those baskets were tightly woven to
And
store,
right.
not just carry water, but to store liquid as well. But like as a child, I remember we had those miniature baskets that we would put trinkets and jewelry in, or we would save and things like that. But what are some of the ways that you think we could, what could I say, make basketry and weaving attractive, especially in our global community, especially in our very highly, we consume things so rapidly, fashion, trends, even in terms of design, how you would outfit your house. The other weaving aspects I would grow up with as a child, a mat, you would
Yeah.
say, all these plastic baskets that we're now using, we would have a woven basket. How do we make that attractive again when we're in this global market and it's not just consuming commercial things, but global in terms of our philosophies and our perspectives? As
Hmm.
Jamaicans, we're exposed to so many other worldviews and we fashion ourselves. It's just easy to do and what is
Yeah.
acceptable.
Yeah. Well, there's a resurgence, I think, of craft and general DIY among a lot of people in terms of there is a need to kind of break away from capitalist structures. So to have places to rest, to be able to have creative outlets, you see like paint and sips. People are not necessarily going to paint something beautiful, but they're going to release. So what if basketry and just straw weaving generally could provide that kind of outlet? And as I said before, this is a very rigorous kind of process. So innovation is most likely needed, but there also should be a retention of those main aspects of the medium. So it's thinking about how can we get this technique more out into the public as a way of having a creative outlet, of having solace, of being generally just like creative, without that stigma that prevents people from wanting to explore further. Can't hear
In the
you.
way that the paint and sip is being done. That's interesting. That's interesting.
Usually the family would be all creating baskets together, or you'd have a mother and their her children are around her also learning from her and making these baskets. In other cultures, these practices are more done in a communal sense, but I think there's a general loss of community due to the rise in individualism. So a lot of different factors contribute to the way that people are creating by themselves, but also the disappearance of different crafts. So these things are all linked with colonialism and capitalism and individualism. And so to talk about communally creating is also very much adhering to a decolonial process generally. So I think there is room for people to start making together, and it's done inadvertently without calling it decolonial or calling it something that is community oriented. But there is still a need to purposefully make those decisions because the crafts that we feel nostalgic about or love are disappearing at a very fast rate, as well as other art forms that we used to have in our day to day and are now being switched out for products that are mass produced.
So, what about the techniques? You also mentioned the technique of how the M empu, what's it called? The empu
I
cap,
don't know how
the
it's
muppu
pronounced.
cap, right?
Yes,
How it started
yeah,
from the center to the
yes,
end. Were there
yes.
any other techniques? Because the stories behind the technique could be a selling point or a buying point because I'm thinking about we have art classes in schools. The schools, it's usually the children if you want to preserve something that you start with because you said majority of the basket makers now are senior citizens, 60 to 80, you know. That's the age where you're looking to mentor somebody to pass on some kind of heritage. But outside of that technique, what other technique did you come across?
I learned a few techniques, well, a few meaning two techniques while I was
A
there.
few.
These techniques, it's very long to catch on, but I think that I did a decent job of getting the techniques down. I don't remember the exact names of these techniques at the moment. It was more, I think there's like a lot of names discussed as to what they're called, but as with a lot of this history, it is very oral. So the names of techniques can range based on who you speak to. Um, but as for the baskets and the items that derive from like the Congo region, the Muppa basket was really the only basket that I could find of the technique. And I think similarly to the history that has a lot of gaps in basketry in Jamaica, there similarly could be gaps in histories that are in the African continent because I could try to connect these histories, but as I was saying, it's piecing together things that might have happened but happened around the same time and have similar designs because this history was not really cherished.
So also, I would want to bring into the conversation Rastafari.
Mhm.
So brooms made by, right. I grew up with the broom, and even if I wanted to get one of those very tall, that we would call it a cobber broom, the one with the very long stick, we would look for the broom man to pass by with that. So I know that's one aspect of linking straw weaving with spirituality. Um,
Yeah.
what in your research did you find about Rastafari and continuation, or to say, keep the tradition or the techniques of straw weaving in how they created their stuff?
I didn't really look too far into Rastafari and their connection with straw weaving. I mostly looked at the Maroons and looked at the Tainos and that kind of lineage. And I think with many things, this research is still very open, and I'm still looking for more connections and finding more things, and also refuting things that maybe I had seen when I had first started out, because with a lot of these things, history is currently it's always there's always gaps to be filled. So that is another point of research, maybe the Rastafarians and their connections with straw weaving. That could be a next point of research for me.
How did you become interested in this topic?
Well, I became interested in basketry and straw weaving from textiles generally and their
Okay.
social capacity. I had what's it called? I was really interested in embroidery and fabric printing generally from like a physical standpoint, and also like tearing up old clothes to create new things. Uh, I grew up around a lot of people who had old clothes to give me. And so I was constantly inspired by the different patternings and different dyes and colors that came with textiles. So there's always been a link for me with cloth and material. And it is recently that I've found the connection past the physical, because there is a connection to textiles that has the potential for community building, as I said, and preservation that is more tangible and is generational.
Have you seen any of the patterns or the techniques that you could transfer to textile from basketry or from straw weaving? Is there any space for merging, or because that's one way you could keep the technique alive as well? What's a
Definitely.
possibility? Depends, seeing that the materials are so different.
So actually, um, as I mentioned before, the Lucayan Tainos, who were the first peoples to be in Jamaica, or first peoples that we know of, um, we share a history with the Bahamas. The Lucayan Tainos were also present there. And what they had done was they preserved their baskets by printing the um, the patterns into clay. So they actually were able to preserve some aspects of that history with clay forms. And the Tainos in Jamaica were also known for redwood pottery. So I find it interesting that they might not have gone that direction, but at least in Bahamas, there is um, links to merging different mediums together to aid in the preservation of one. So I feel with basketry, we can definitely learn from the woven patterns. And I'm sure there are probably some techniques where people print the patterns onto fabric, but I do know that there are cultures that print these basket patterns into the pottery that they create.
Climate. Encouraging persons towards industry is usually a method that is used, one that is explored by whenever there's an intervention, because the idea also is that persons from the lower classes are targeted to do these things. Because it's either two ends of the continuum. It's either persons from the lower class to give them a skill to say they can become industrious and earn for themselves, or it's going to become a hobby at the higher end, the middle and upper class, to make basket as paint and sip. So, where do you really draw the line on this if you want to preserve the technique? So, the
Definitely.
economic aspect really have to be something that is involved in the conversation.
Yes.
While from your presentation, it would appear as if you, not that you're bashing, but you're not pushing commercialization because you're saying that's not a good enough reason for it to be passed on. Originally, persons were making baskets or doing basketry for domestic purposes, right? But seeing that this is something when you've exhausted all the raffia that you have and the material to make a basket, then you move over to making more and the excess you use as business. But when you went to the craft market that's close to us, tell us about that experience and what were those vendors sharing about selling any of their basket goods and products.
Well, before I get to that, I wanted to reiterate that though I had pushed for baskets to not be seen solely in an economic light, I still think that it should be used economically, or it still will be used in an economic sense, because that is the state of or society at the moment. Also, the people who are making these baskets should be paid fairly for the work that they are made. I'm just reiterating that it should not only be seen in that way because it is not a sustainable way of continuing a medium. So there needs to be a balance, or there needs to be a shift in the percentage of how much we view it as an economic tool versus a social and a political, or a political, social and decolonial
And
tool.
before you answer about the market, I just thought that maybe also some of the knowledge bearers, maybe they are not able to pass on the knowledge in, say, a lecture style, in a workshop scenario, in the way that we're used to doing that. So maybe, like your interview, they would need persons like you to act as a facilitator and to bring them in that understand and to help to explain, the techniques to other persons that they're teaching. So that's another thing that could be considered as well.
Yeah, I mean, the the main reason that I'm able to speak on this is because I don't have to see it in an economic sense. So I'm able to see it and like from an ancestral point of view, from a culture point of view, because I have the privilege of seeing it from that perspective. But the people who are actually continuing this craft and are doing the work to try and continue these techniques, they have to sell their product. They have to, have their craft out to be marketable. So they don't have the luxury always of seeing it from a culture perspective, but also they weren't able to access this knowledge anyways. So imagine if they were able to have access to this knowledge, what could that do for their crafts? Could they get inspiration
To
from,
price their craft sensibly if they
yes,
had the knowledge behind it and the technique and to see the value of it. As you say, that they should be paid properly for these techniques and the crafts, but if they don't know, they can't charge for that.
It's not that they don't know anything. They do have a lot of knowledge on their craft, but the knowledge from the people that I did speak to ends with the teachings from their great grandparents, and there is no continuation past that. So the knowledge that they do have, while it is valuable still, imagine how much more expansive it could be if they knew about the connections that we have to Tainos and connections that we have to the African continent. Because even I have just barely touched this history because there is so much more to unpack that you cannot find in archives, you cannot find on the internet because it's still a very oral history. So the question is, how do we find this? And also, what do we do with it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, to come back to your question.
Right.
So when I first went to the craft market, a lot of the vendors that I had spoken to actually didn't really know much about the baskets because they had bought these baskets from people who were in much more rural areas. So there's like historic weaving communities like Glengoff in St. Catherine, where a lot of these vendors may have bought these baskets from. So they don't necessarily know the way that they're made, but they have communications with these people to then sell these baskets on their behalf.
And what about the school? You said that you were surprised when you went to the school that the
Yes.
students, their knowledge.
So that they didn't really have much knowledge on this history, but also I framed this historical retelling through reclaiming or narratives because a lot of our history has been told through a colonial perspective, and that means um, we've often there's been rules established that our culture is inhumane, that we are not human. So because of that, um, we need to reclaim this history to then be able to reclaim our humanity, but not even to reclaim because we always continuously had it, but the colonial perceptions kind of clouded, views and things like that. But to reclaim our history and reclaim our knowledge is a step in decolonizing. Um, and I think, was it Marcus Garvey? He had this quote about to know our history is something to do with roots. I don't remember exactly, but I'm sure you could say it or talk to that. But to talk about a lot of the times we think of ourselves only as Jamaican and not as anything apart from that. And that's fine to be we're nationalistic people, that is very known, but also there are a lot of things to be learned from when looking past that, because Jamaica, as great as it is birthed from a colonial, a colony. So a lot of our ideals and our cultures are based in that. So there needs to be a deconstruction of our identity to then learn from um, the issues that come with the Jamaican identity in a very overgeneralized term, but or overgeneralized way of saying that. But a lot of the students were saying that they're Jamaican and they had no other link. So that was very interesting because it links to our kind of disinterest in African culture. I think a general culture disinterest in that. And what does that mean for us now? Yeah.
I understand exactly what you're saying because if you were to think about your school history, when did you started to learn that you were of African descent? How was it presented to you? It was never until like at university level. And we know what percentage of our population gets to tertiary education. So you're talking, and all I'm thinking about is education. And I heard that there was a reintroduction of civics in school. And it's really at the education level that we have to start making these things valuable. And there is now a Jamaica Day, there is now a Africa Day celebrated in school. And for the most part, what we hear about is Jamaican culture, not our African beginnings, not our African history, unless we're talking about the people who came, and we just talk about it in a general way. We talk about the Europeans and things like that.
Not
And
creating any and the people who came.
right. But it in a way there is an alienation that we are Jamaicans and they were the Africans and things like that. So it's areas like those that we would have to address because there's a gap. There's a gap there.
Yes.
Definitely. But
So
it's
as I
interesting, this topic that you're on, and I think you have already mentioned where do we go from here, with basketry. I think you have a lot of research to do, a lot of documenting to do. I hope the ACIJ can be helpful in that area, not just in putting it in our archive, but also probably, finding persons who we can connect you with so we can find some of those techniques and some of those crafts to carry on. I am not seeing any more questions from our guests online. I think I asked you all of them. But it was a very interesting conversation, and it's it is something that we have to explore some more. I'd like to get you on another curating culture when you find more, because we've not gone into the spirituality of baskets and the availability of the material and yeah, things like that, where you find it, how you find it, and things like that. So it was very nice having you, Hannah. My producer is saying we have another question. Please send me that question real quick. While we wait on the next question, let me remind our faithful viewers that our dancehall or male fashion in dancehall exhibition is still up. It will be up until June the 30th at the ACIJ, JMB, African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank. You can view the exhibition between 9 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. And coming up in March, we will have our International Storytelling Day where the ACIJ will partner with Ntukuma to deposit their collection into the Jamaica Member Bank. I think we have the questions here now. So it's a question from Sharon Smith. It says that would love to see craft encouraged at the CSEC level. It's more a comment than a question. That she would love to see craft encouraged at the CSEC level, and it may start the process of innovation as well. The other one is, did you intend to visit West Africa to further your research?
Definitely, I think making that connection between Africanist diaspora is extremely important, not only for me personally, but to kind of bridge that gap that has been created by colonial retellings of our history. So I think specifically looking into fabric printing history and weaving history is very important for not only my practice, but then into creating those links and seeing. I think people sometimes need to see to believe, and seeing the similarities between our existing history, example in basketry, but maybe even crocheting and other crafts that we currently have in Jamaica, seeing those links could definitely encourage that exploration of our African ancestry in a deeper sense. So
Hannah Smith, it was very good to have you on Creating Culture, and we look forward to having you again when you further your research. Thank you to the faithful guests online and for everyone who has joined us. We will see you again for our other series in Curating Culture. I am not hearing I'm not hearing what my producer is saying. Hannah, I'm going to allow you to speak.
you thank the ACIJ. Thank you to Treasure Beach Women's Group, who's also assisted me in this research. Thank you to the many artisans that I've spoke to. I spoke to Verna. I spoke to Christina, Denise, Diane. I spoke to artist Lucille. I'm grateful for the many different people who have been willing to speak to me about their histories and experiences with basketry. So thank you.
Channels online on Instagram, on Facebook, and on X. And please join us again next month, the first Thursday, for our next Curating Culture. Bye, everyone.